engage enough with the topic at hand today, which I'm extremely glad we've got a full room here. But I'll get onto that in a minute. Housekeeping before we start. That camera over there is connected to the internet. This event is being live streamed and going out on the SMF YouTube channel. That means that when we get to questions, you're not just talking to people in the room, you're talking to the whole of the internet, and also the meeting is going to be preserved online, forever after. So bear that in mind when we're talking. Running order, in a second, I will hand over to Seema Malhotra, who requires little introduction as the Shadow Minister for Business and Consumers. She'll be followed by Catherine Howarth from ShareAction, and finally we will hear from Paul Lindley. I'm not going to give I won't give you their illustrious biographies. They can explain to you who they are and why you should listen to them. You should listen to them. But after we've had their opening thoughts, we will have opportunity for questions and comments from all of you. I would prefer when we get there those to be questions rather than comments. I'm a recovering journalist. I have a horror of speeches pretending to be questions, so at least pretend to put a question mark at the end of your comment. I think that's about all from me. I promise not to go on too much later on. I'm quite enthusiastic about the subject. So I'm going to hand over to Seema. Seema, just to recap, I suppose, on the title of our event. I'm going to remind myself of it. How can Labour encourage companies to do more for people and the planet?
Great. Well, thank you very much, James. And it's absolutely wonderful to be here. I have had various interactions over the years with the Social Market Foundation, and always enjoy your events because they're often at the forefront of where the next debate's going to come and really take off. And not just that, but I think this is an area where, to be frank, I think we've got a very good history on this. It is an area where, to have a sustainable solution that is for the longer term, we also need to be thinking across party on a number of these areas. It is interesting. I was reflecting that it was, probably a long time ago now, probably about almost 20 years ago. It feels like, I think it was, that we did a debate when I was on the Young Fabians on the ethics of good business, and it was just at the sort of start of a kind of previous wave of really thinking about kind of responsibility, and it was kind of corporate social responsibility then, which has really kind of morphed into the sort of new thinking around ESG, which I think is capturing in different ways a different mood in the public about wanting to be wiser consumers about what they're purchasing, really thinking about where people are wanting to work, and talking to a university professor the other day, and even students saying they don't want to necessarily go and just work in a workplace because they feel that their labour should be going into something that's making a difference for the planet, or much more aligned with their values. So I think there really is going to be a generational shift that's going to challenge, in my view, the status quo, and I think it's going to challenge our politics much more strongly. This is, I think, in my view, going beyond the way that climate has been put on the agenda, and I think accelerated onto the agenda by obviously sort of the next generation's voices, but also the view being that people don't want to go into jobs where they're going to be left to clean up the mess of what corporates are leaving behind, because the next generations are going to have to deal with this. So I think that kind of view about responsibility to people and to planet is starting to challenge our politics in those different ways. I think it's also just important to reflect on the place that we've reached post-COVID, because during COVID we saw how businesses really stepped up to think differently about their roles in communities, and think differently about how they might need to look after their employees, who in turn were looking after their families alongside trying to continue working and keep the economy moving where we could. So this question about how we recognise responsible business, recognise their stake and their position in society, is not that they just want to create profits, but also to operate with a social purpose, embedding themselves within their communities and working in the interests of employees, profits and the planet. What's also, however, I think a challenge to us as politicians is to say, well, look, we've got some good examples of businesses starting to make different choices. But where do we need to start to think about different legislative frameworks as well? And I think this is where, in some senses, businesses. And I think we'll obviously hear from Paul about Paul's businesses as well. But there's been a sort of a trend of solving and addressing kind of social issues through different products, and ESG being also kind of partly more about also doing good as well as making profits from kind of more ethical practice. But in a sense, these businesses are starting to set the direction of travel. And what's clear to me is that the rules and the institutions of the UK economy haven't really kept up with the ambition of these more purposeful businesses. And too often, in a sense, things are tilted against businesses wanting to do the right thing and having a framework that's going to be there to support them. I think it is clear as well that businesses are starting to challenge politicians. I'm having these conversations more and more regularly to enable and incentivize these approaches. And I do think that the Better Business Act movement is actually going to be putting I hope, kind of very positive kind of push on legislators as to how we need to have legislation catch up with where the public mood and public attitudes are, but also where we should be if we're to meet our climate goals, but also to meet some of our social goals. Because as we've been saying this week, economic justice, social justice, and climate justice have got to go hand in hand. And it is why we need a partnership between business, between the private sector and workers, and with government. And so I'll just end on a kind of a few points around this. Firstly, we made an announcement yesterday on mandatory climate reporting, consistent with net zero, starting obviously with FTSE 100, and because company law and directors' duties, which entrench shareholder primacy, oversee really as part of the creation of wealth, and we can have a different approach where it's the benefit, whether it's the creation of wealth for the benefit of all. New sources of patient capital, we could be looking at this for public and private, which could allow businesses to plan and act for the long term. Because all too often we've seen kind of short-term thinking resulting in short-term reporting, and then not seeing the kind of long-term change that, in a sense, planning for the planet as well as for people and the stability that we want to see in the workplace is going to need. So this is one example of where we could be looking at the role of national and regional investment banks that could be lending and encouraging lending to businesses of all sizes with fairer terms and conditions, encouraging investment that they may make. Thirdly, we've talked about this, which is around takeover rules, which can protect firms against hostile takeovers. We've seen the rise in takeovers after the kind of the lockdown, not least because British businesses have been undervalued on the stock market as well. But what often can happen is that these hostile takers can These hostile takeovers they extract wealth, and they kind of break up assets rather than produce wealth. And what we said is that genuine public interest takeover regime, a genuine public interest takeover regime is needed, and plus tax changes as well to go with that. And we would be calling for a change in the law on that too. And fourthly, ensuring the stake of voice of workers in purposeful businesses. Angela announced a new deal for working people at the weekend, and part of this is it's not just about kind of wages, terms and conditions, but I think it is important to say, how do we revisit that debate about the role and the voice of workers in organisations? Not least, as I said, because people are beginning to be much more choosy about where they spend their time and how they earn their living. And we can also look to see a renaissance in cooperative and employee-owned sector. As a Labour and Co-op MP, this I think is extremely interesting. And a year ago, I also wrote a piece on a cooperative recovery and about how we could be building on the what we've seen through the downturn of people coming together in their communities in a different way, and how we might be able to really recognise that and build that into how we see a rebuilding of our economy after the pandemic. So just finally to say, we very much want to engage with you on all of these issues. It's important to us to see this move on in terms of how policymakers are thinking, but also how we might be able to get some consensus around where we should reform legislation, because it is vital that we are in line with the ambitions of people for this country, in line with our own aspirations as a party, and make sure that our legislative framework is fit for purpose. Thank you.
Thank you, Seema. And you've just very neatly reminded me, I was slightly remiss in my my introduction, that I failed to explain the banner currently behind me, which is the Better Business Act banner. We're doing this event in partnership with our friends from the Better Business Act, and later on I may actually drag some of them in to actually explain precisely, for those of you who don't know, precisely what is meant by the Better Business Act, when I'm sure we will get into some of the detailed conversation about some of those legislative changes that you mentioned. So, but we will come to that in due course. Our next speaker is Catherine Howarth from ShareAction.
Thank you very much, James. Terrific to be here. Thanks for the invitation. So I'm just going to give a few little opening remarks, but particularly to frame the need for a Better Business Act, which I'll come on to and I think would be a really transformative and very important and interesting development, with a need for probably something in parallel, which I'll call a Responsible Investment Act, that would actually ensure that the other side of the table, which is the capital providers, are kind of in alignment. And the Best Business Act is all about alignment between profits, people, and planet, but actually is potentially at risk of not delivering its maximum value if we don't actually have the providers of capital, which the biggest of whom is actually pension funds, of whom millions and millions of working people contribute every month. That we need alignment between all these parts of our economic and capitalist system. So just sort of some framing that I think, like government itself, and indeed like civil society itself, business has the power to be and can be a massive force for good, or can create more harm than good. That's quite clear, that there's the capacity both to be an enormous solution to the world's great problems, or to exacerbate and be a generator of many of the problems that society has to contend with. And within the business community, there's incredible diversity and a growing number, as Seema said, of firms that want to be fully involved in playing their part in solving the world's pressing problems. I mean, most importantly, perhaps most existentially, the climate crisis, where companies clearly have an incredible potential and are producing really exciting solutions to accelerate the transition that we need to so urgently undertake. But equally well, we still have lots of high carbon businesses that are polluting. So, businesses sitting on both sides of that agenda. Similarly, the equalities agenda, there are incredible companies that are going the extra mile all the time to kind of promote diverse talent, to bring diverse thinking at all levels of the company through. Paul will probably speak to the public health agenda, but again, I think there are companies out there who are just doing an amazing job to provide the solutions to the world's great public health issues. And we've only got to look and think about the incredible pace at which the private sector stepped up to provide vaccines, which mean, we're all in this room today and are able to be together again. But equally well, companies, lots of them, are producing many of the really problematic health inequalities that undermine social justice. So there we have it. There's this running tension almost within the business community, and my sense is that business leaders are really stepping into demanding from government an enabling framework and a level playing field that allows those businesses that want to be solutions providers, that want to be responsible, to operate within a kind of legal regulatory framework that doesn't put them at a disadvantage over those companies that are all too happy to export environmental costs onto the rest of society, to export social costs onto the rest of the society. So that, I think, is the crucial role of government. It's not to micromanage and over-regulate the business community, but rather to create an enabling framework and a level playing field. And to listen to the parts of the business community that are stepping forward. And it's really exciting to see it. We were just sort of briefly discussing how the Institute of Directors has sort of emerged as this amazing champion of responsible business, calling for a Better Business Act. Well, that's the business community saying we need government to create the framework, legislatively speaking, that will allow those of us that want to be responsible, want to be solutions providers, to do so without being at a disadvantage, financially speaking, relative to companies that choose not to go that path. So the company, I don't want to bang on at too much length about the Better Business Act, because we've got people in the room that understand it better than me. But I do think it's a really interesting and neat solution. It's a very simple solution, actually. But let me just say for a few moments why I think it needs to be matched by a Responsible Investment Act. Because ultimately, the Better Business Act, which is proposing very interesting adjustments to directors' duties so that they have to put on a level playing field their obligation to their shareholders with their obligations to society and environment. But it would not sort of completely unravel what's called shareholder primacy. So it would retain in law a primary obligation for large shareholders, actually shareholders of all sizes, but because it's a one share, one vote situation, large shareholders have huge power in the system, to hold companies accountable. And the way that's done primarily is by voting directors onto boards and then voting them off if they don't deliver the strategy of the company or seem to be delivering on their legal obligations. Those big investors at the moment operate in a legal environment in which, and I'm thinking here of pension funds, I'm thinking here of big asset managers, in which their only and primary obligation is to maximize profit. So if you've got the providers of capital sending that signal down to business directors who have, who are operating inside a nice new enlightened regime called the Better Business Act, you'll kind of have a disjuncture in the system where the accountability is to players who still privilege profit maximization over all other objectives. And that's why I think we need, and Labour should grasp the opportunity, if I may say so, of putting in place both the Better Business Act and Responsible Investment Act. So both sides, both the investors who are the providers of capital and the businesses who deploy that capital into productive uses in the real economy, are aligned in putting this, equality between profit, people, and planet. So I won't say anymore because I'm going to probably use up the time. But I think there's a really exciting opportunity to create, if I may say so, probably a cross-party consensus around this, to bring business together, to bring civil society together, to bring the trade unions together, representing workers and workers' capital in the capital markets, and for the UK to be an absolute global leader in creating the framework that allows business to get on with solving some of the great challenges. And business has such potential at this critical moment in our history to do that. And that's why I'm so pleased to be handing over to Paul, whose business is a completely wonderful example of a company solving big problems.
Thank you. And before you do that, I should just advertising for the SMF, on your point about cross-party consensus. Strongly agree, but I would say like they're on a cross-party think tank. But we are also doing essentially a matching version of this event next week in Manchester at the Conservative Party conference. If any of you happen to be professional conference goers, there are some. I know such things exist. Then you can come and have this conversation again with some Conservatives as well. Which I think is a sign of Catherine's exact point there. This is something that is finding purchase across the board. Anyway, sorry, forgive the interruption. Paul Lindley.
Thank you. Thank you, James. So I'm Paul. I founded Ella's Kitchen, baby food business, one of the UK's first B corporations, so I'll probably drift into that. But I was going to start on a sort of helicopter view, which I always start with when thinking about anything new, and that is why. But the question why? Why are we looking for an economy that can get progressively more prosperous? Why have we spent a day today looking at business and the economy and overlapping with a political party and society? And the why is much beyond creating prosperity through goods and services that help improve our lives, which is kind of the point of businesses and the economy, because businesses and work give us dignity of work, of connectedness to other people. It gives us the ability to learn, which is a fundamental human thing, and to make mistakes and to sort of find ourselves. And when you start to ask the question why, you get to kind of purpose, I think. And I reflected on that as I was setting up my business, why I was doing it, and constantly when I sold it, why I sold it, and what it's doing now, why. But I think the answer of purpose is what fundamentally drives us as human beings. And the purpose of our economy surely is to improve the lives of the people living in the environment and the communities that those businesses are working in. And so starting from that position, the economy is not independent from the rest of society. Its purpose is to improve society. So that's one thing. Then I often start with the word company itself. The word company is from the Latin cum and panis, it's with bread, and it's about people sitting down, breaking bread together with aligned interest, aligned appetite to risk. It's people-based. It's not companies are all about profit, and it doesn't matter what kind of profit or what you do to get that profit. It is about people coming together with an idea of a business, finding other people to invest in it, employing people to work in it, and selling goods and services to people who buy from it. And it's integrated and interdependent with the rest of society. So that's my sort of macro belief of why we've got an economy and what businesses are for beyond making money, and why we ought to make money in a society in a sort of fair and inclusive way and all of that. So then that comes down to where we are today. And when I was at university like 30 years ago, Milton Friedman was going to save the world, and I did economics and politics, and it was like the political right took on board what he was saying, and businesses were only there to maximize their shareholder value. That was the mantra, and kind of trickle-down economics would bring a rising tide, and we'd all benefit from that. 30, 40 years later, we're not doing so. So something has either we didn't implement it right, or something it was wrong in the first place. So we've gone through in that period of time. I sort of reflect, we've been through 2 or 3 real crises. We're in this volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world where we don't know what's coming next. We've got to prepare our children for what's coming next. We've got to prepare our businesses to thrive with this world that we can't really predict. And I think the best ways to have our businesses thrive from that is build them on a purpose and a set of values of understanding why we're here. Because if we don't do that, we are focused on the profit over the short term, and we'll lose our way because we don't know what's coming next. So if you set them in values, so that's how I try to build business that I created, and that's how I try to invest in the businesses that I see potential in going forward. So the way I see it is that we've got an economic system that is in sort of need of reset. We have this interdependence of sort of government and business and civil society all trying to do the same things to increase goods and services and the prosperity of the country to benefit us all. We've got the interdependence of trade unions and business owners and entrepreneurs and the IOD and CBI and people all trying to do the same thing, but all thinking they're on different sides of the balance. We've got an economy that is kind of driving inequality at the moment. I know from the I shouldn't say it is, it's one of your competitors, James, but a report that was out from the IPPR a couple of years ago around how basically the economy had grown between 2010 and 2018 by 12% in real terms, yet real wages had fallen by 6%. So in my simple maths, there's 18% of wealth created. Where's that gone? Because it's not gone to people in the community. And really, it went to the balance sheets of big companies who made a lot of money, weren't confident that the political situation or the economic situation was right to invest that and to trickle that down in Friedman's world. And it's just sat there on big companies' balance sheets, and it's not benefited any of us. So investing for sort of justice, if you like, is what I think the Labour Party and the overlap between politics and economics can get us to be, where it doesn't matter what school you come from, if you've got an opportunity to get a job, it doesn't matter what sort of entrepreneur, if you've got a good idea and you're an entrepreneur, it doesn't rely on the networks that you've got or the banks that you can get a hold of to get the funding. And within businesses, it doesn't rely on the colour of your skin or your gender or anything to get promoted and get to board levels. And then the final sort of thought about whether the economic system doesn't work anymore. is really around accounting for all stakeholders, which kind of comes onto this subject. You know, Freeman said it was shareholders and shareholders only. Yet, you know, businesses operate within the rest of society, and the ways that we've found so far to sort of set the values of a company in an economic regulatory system that can work for more than just the shareholders is the B Corporation movement. And so there are about 500 B Corps in the UK. We have changed the constitution, the Articles of Association of our companies to say, in my language, we are no longer about the primacy of shareholders, maximising shareholder return. We are about optimising stakeholder returns. And that kind of is the heart of what, that's a voluntary thing you apply for, and businesses that have signed up think they've got better long-term businesses with more loyal staff, with a purpose behind them. Everyone can get behind them, we make more money as a consequence, not those other things as a consequence of making more money. And the Better Business Act is really an extension of that by saying these companies do tremendously well. I know B Corps have grown 28% faster than non-B Corp companies in this country. They are often smaller companies, and they are, but they've grown fast. So, so the Better Business Act is about saying in the Companies Act those things that we've changed in our individual articles of association. That directors have a responsibility, not primarily to shareholders and then consider everybody else that is a stakeholder, but equal responsibilities to stakeholders. So in a business like Ella's Kitchen, for example, you know, if the management team thought that it was a good idea to increase the price of packaging by a penny, but make it more recyclable, then in theory they shouldn't do that for their shareholders. But as responsible members of the society and the values of all the people that work there, if they've got the opportunity to that, they should do that. And we shouldn't have a law that says that you can be sued for not doing that. So, so what can Labour do? I think it can do. It can take on board by itself or in collaboration with lots of all the other parties proposals around the BBA. And I could go on about other areas of capitalism that I think might retain capitalism but change things around monopolies and externalities and all things like that we need to address at some stage.
Thank you. We'll have 27 minutes in which for you to do that. So, now, given that we have got nearly about half an hour to you for some questions, I'm going to take advantage of my position here to ask one question, or I'll put a mild provocation to all of you. Partly because I agree with you, and therefore I feel obliged to disagree with you, if you see what I mean. Which is around, I guess, it was a thought really raised by Catherine when you mentioned the fiduciary duty on investors and pensions. So, what we're talking about here is essentially the use to which we put capital, and a lot of that capital comes from all of us in our pensions. So when we save into our pensions, they go off into a pot and they're managed by somebody somewhere, somebody who's represented in this room, and those representatives those managers are under a duty to get as much money as possible back for us for our retirement. That's their job. And likewise, the directors' companies, it's their job to maximise return for shareholders. What we're talking about here is a slightly different approach to the allocation of capital. Is it the case, do you think, that we actually have to accept a trade-off? That to have more purposeful use of capital, we will actually have to accept and therefore get buy-in from our electorates, from publics for lower returns, or is there actually a holy grail that squares the circle? And Paul, you mentioned it as the 28% figure. The purposeful business actually outperforms less purposeful business. Can we actually do both things at the same time? Do better and make more money, or do we have to be a bit more hard to accept a trade-off? I don't know who anybody want to challenge or accept the essay question. Catherine, you inspired the question.
Okay.
You should go first.
Yes. So, I mean, the good news is there are lots of what is being called in the jargon win-wins. So you can make more money by doing the right thing, and there are lots of examples out there. Ella's Kitchen is probably a brilliant example, but there are many more. But it would be naive, I think, to think that that's always the case. truth is it can also be quite profitable to be exploitative, to pollute and not pay for the cleanup, or to operate in a more expensive way that involves less impact upon the environment. It similarly can be sadly still very profitable to exploit labour and to move into kind of 0 hours contracts and to make your workforce more precarious than it need be. I mean, there's also examples, of course, that companies that have gone the high road when it comes to labour practices and who make a virtue of attracting better staff. I mean, I've spent years working on the UK living wage campaign, and the wonderful news is that huge numbers of companies that have committed to living wage standards, which are about 20% above the minimum wage, virtually all of them profess that that's been a better route to go, that they've got higher quality of workforce. So I'm not saying there will always be a trade-off, but I am acknowledging that there's sometimes a trade-off, and that trade-off is not necessarily in the interests of the shareholders. Now, who are the shareholders? I want to come back to that point, because the shareholders are actually, obviously there are lots and lots of, increasing numbers of billionaires out there. So it's not as if they're all ordinary working people. But one of the amazing things that this country has done is pensions automatic enrolment, which, about 10 years ago or so, meant that everyone, whether you work in McDonald's or in one of the shops on the high street or as a care worker, is part of a pension scheme, often part of Nest, which is this huge mega scheme that was set up for employers that didn't have much know-how about the pension system, but is actually operating as a hugely sophisticated player in the landscape. So working people are shareholders, but they're not very empowered in this system. The money is handed over to very sophisticated asset managers who at the moment have to operate within this regime, as you've described, where the single overriding purpose is to maximize wealth. And what we're saying is needed is as an objective, which is still about maximizing positive outcomes for the end savers, but where we think about sort of shareholder welfare rather than just purely shareholder wealth. Because is it in my interests or in any of your interests that your pension fund invests in, even if highly profitable companies that are driving us towards climate catastrophe? No, it's not. So that those things have to be kind of weighed up and balanced up. And the law at the moment in the investment sphere doesn't permit it. It just says your welfare equals the maximization of profits in the pension scheme. And that's actually a constraint on asset managers who actually could operate in a much more kind of balanced way, but the law doesn't permit it. And I think if we had that change alongside a shift and a recalibration of directors' duties, like I say, I think we really would be well on our way to having the framework we need to put business on the path it wants to go, which is solving our great problems of today.
Thank you. Paul, too. I don't know if you Paul, would you like to expand on the is there a trade-off?
Oh, well, I'm going to take the challenge back to whether you're asking the right question. Or you are asking the right question, whether we've got the rules straight that the question is the right one. Because ultimately your question is about, should we go for quality or quantity? Quantity of maximising returns versus quality of the returns of the improvements to life of the goods and services and the companies that we've created. And the structures that we've created through the Companies Act and the evolution of an industrialised country, it is that we go for quantity, and we talk about GDP. Well, GDP includes the cost of the ambulance that picks up the car crash that the person was drinking, and the beer was positive in this, and the car was, and the insurance on the car was, an ambulance, and the lock on the door of the prison that the person goes into who shouldn't have been drinking. All of that stuff is positive in quantity, adds to GDP. And we've got to create a system where actually the negatives in there and the education of our children or public debates like this are not accounted for GDP. So we don't measure. We measure the wrong thing, is what I'm trying to say, and we measure over the wrong timescale as well, because short-term decisions our institutions incentivize us to make short-term decisions. If you're a CEO of a public company, you're incentivized in some way to have good quarterly returns that would be the last lot. So you may make decisions that satisfy those shareholders because your bonus is coming up or they want to sell or something that closes a factory that you don't have to account for the externalities of that factory in that town because your share price is going to go up because you make some efficiency or something in the short term. Likewise, our politicians, ultimately, they're interested, forgive me, Seema, but in elections next time and before you. But we should be thinking as human beings about 20 years and our pension, and 50 years and our environment and all of those things. But the system isn't designed to help us make those long-term decisions. The same as school. I've been going about schools and exams every 2 years. So how do we change the metrics about what we're measuring? Now, we could do that. There's something called the long-term stock exchange in the US, in California, where it's not the percentage of the shares that you own that you vote, so it's how long you've had them as well. Now, you don't want to take that too long, so you've got no liquidity. But, if you can buy shares today and sell them tomorrow at a 20% uplift, the economy, the world hasn't increased by 20%, and yet you've got value out of that. So how do we encourage the right decisions by the better metrics is kind of where I was going. Then we've got the kind of idea of, well, we live in a capitalist world. It'd be a good idea if more and more people had capital to be able to invest. Now, we do with pensions, or those of us lucky enough to have pensions, but there's a disconnect between how we think we're involved in our decisions over our pensions and what we actually have the power to do. And we've got to close that. And a lot of that might be through language or through like public awareness campaigns, or just connecting us closer to our money. So you get the ridiculous situations where, I don't know, a car workers union's pension might be invested in things that don't help the car workers themselves. I don't know, a company that makes you obese or something, that doesn't help those people themselves. So the two ends of the people who manage the pensions and the people who are putting their money into the pensions aren't connected sufficiently.
This is a point. If it was another event, we had another hour, we talk about something called pensions dashboard, which is again one of the holy grails of pension policy reform. It's the ability to actually see your pension on a screen, so you know exactly what you hold. We're actually doing an event on maybe touch on that next week in Manchester. If you're interested in pensions dashboard, come there.
So I just think that as we make our decision when we go in and I don't know, we want to buy a smoothie and we believe that the one has the bobble hat on that's going to help grannies and stuff, rather than the one next to it is the one we buy and it's more or less the same price. Why don't we do that with our pensions? And why is the system incentivized to keep us in the dark? I've just done something with Catherine and ShareAction about holding Tesco to account with one share. I bought one share in Tesco, 100 people bought one share in Tesco. We were able to table something about the healthiness of their food at Tesco's AGM. So I'll wrap up by saying there's three ways to change these things. I think there's one, government top down. We can change the companies out, we can change the purpose of business, we can regulate stuff. Bottom up, we've got younger consumers, younger employees that care about purpose and things like that, and they get informed about where their pensions invested, the more they can change it. And then from the side, as I see it, the financial institutions and the incentives and the kind of structures around how investment works. We could do things with stamp duty, we could do things with long-term stock exchanges, things like that. So ideas rather than solutions.
Thank you. No, Seema, I'm going to put Paul's disgraceful allegation to you. You were a politician interested in getting elected.
Well, let me just say that Paul maybe didn't phrase it as I might have phrased it in that what he said is true. Of course, politicians are interested in winning elections, and we're particularly interested in what's happening in Germany right now. But what I would say is I would slightly challenge one thing, which is that I personally think going into the next election, what the party's records and visions are in relation to some of these themes, whether it's around kind of climate justice or it's around responsibility to our communities, and what we expect from kind of business behaviour, and what our kind of proposals might be around. I think that's going to be an important part of the next elections, in the debate. So I think in a sense, hopefully, there's going to be a question about what we're doing longer term. If there's one kind of real sadness I have about the last 5 years of our politics, is it has been very short term and lurching from kind of a crisis to crisis. And it has impacted our institutions and their resilience. It's impacted our preparedness for some of the challenges we're facing. I think this is a government that unfortunately has had its eye off the ball because it's been on other balls. It's definitely been on other balls, but eye off the country's balls. And I think what the consequence that has had is we don't have good government right now. It is not thinking for the long term and even engaging Parliament in some of the debates. And I'll just take the social care issue as a crisis. I mean, for years you wait for some sort of commission or a cross-party way of working. The reason why we've got auto-enrolment is partly because of the pensions commission that we had, that I was involved in at that time, particularly around kind of what we were doing around women's pensions and pensions equality. And so there are areas in which you've got to be kind of serious about recognising that reforms are going to go beyond one parliament, and that you want to set those frameworks up. And instead of having a considered commission after years of waiting, we had policy and announcement and legislation within 3 days. And so and that isn't for the long term, and it isn't scrutinised. But I do think that I'll put the challenge back. I feel that as a politician, what we do all year round is almost more important, because we're engaged in debates in our constituencies and think about the world around us through the years that we are elected. And we never re-elected. Well, sometimes you are, but generally not re-elected just on the day. It's kind of been a course of time, and I think there is an appetite for a direction of travel that's different. I think one of the areas, just picking up on your point as well about consumers and employees making different choices that we drew on, I think there's got to be greater transparency, because it's not so much that there's a trade-off between having lower returns and doing better. I think the B Corp's experience is it kind of challenges that assumption, but you may trade off different things. So if you're looking at the funds that your ISA might be going into, or some other savings, you might then have a choice about whether you're investing in some greener funds. And so the transparency actually allows for consumers to be directing kind of company behaviour in different ways along the same sorts of principles, but obviously less directly than ShareAction, but along the same sorts of principles, where I think people do want to say, and you see kind of reactions to the way the world is on different spectrums. It could be protests outside Parliament, or or worse, or but actually there is the spectrum of how people are engaging, and the ease with which you should be able to make it possible for challenges to be brought to decisions made by directors, by on behalf by those whose funds are being invested. So I think that is an important part of how we've got to, I think, change the system to be kind of more transparent and more accessible for people to have a stronger voice, and to say that there isn't necessarily, there may well be some aspect of a trade-off, but generally speaking, I think the direction of travel seems to be that consumers are going to follow better businesses now. And actually, the better businesses that have better returns is not going to be new news as things start to change. And just finally, I think this has to be combined with some challenge to those who are the kind of main polluters, who have sort of got away with creating a mess that someone else pays to clean up. And so I think I hope there's going to be some greater challenge coming out of COP26 and some international consensus. But I think there has to be greater kind of penalty for behaving in a way that is not good corporate behaviour and has impact for planet and people. And there be accountability and costs associated with that somehow. So I think that the challenge to bad behaviour, I think again lends itself to encouraging and incentivizing good behaviour by companies that then can be rewarded with better returns.
Thank you. We've got about 10 minutes left, so we got some. 3 hands gone immediately. I'm going to try and get those 3 hands. Keep going. So Andrew. And there, and then the gentleman behind. Can you watch? There's no microphone. So could you just basically, if you can have thoughts, questions in one crisp cluster, we'll get responses, and then just try and do another round before we wrap it up. But,
Thanks. And we wrote a report with James last year for SMF, which called for a BBA-like proposal, so it's good to see that getting picked up. Just really to Seema, really, which is that, today Rachel Reeves made another big speech with some quite big spending commitments, and Ed Miliband did similarly as in his speech on Sunday. What's Labour's position on getting the best out of business? Is it just that we need to invest more in infrastructure, crowdfund and match fund that investment together? And that feels very similar to what the Tories are offering really at the moment with their levelling up agenda. Or is there a distinctive Labour narrative around how to get the best of the business, which is around this agenda on purpose and long-termism and encouraging an investment?
So that's what's the unique Labour offer.
Hi, I'm Jo Batman. I'm a Labour councillor. I also work for an organisation called Global Witness. I had a question about accountability. So it's interesting seeing the team mention that towards the end of your remarks. I think too often when we see some of the environmental harm and human rights abuses globally, we see them linked to global supply chains and financing, often UK companies that do financing as well, and a real lack of accountability in the system on that. And one thing we've been working on is a due diligence obligation, which is now in the Environment Bill on deforestation risk. And I know it's good to see Labour policy would be to have that due diligence obligation extend to human rights abuses as well. So I'm interested in the views of the panel of where you see that kind of requirement of due diligence and some accountability fitting into this, and maybe particularly for Catherine, also whether you can see that also applying to finance and really how we see accountability fitting in.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I was going to say, this probably has the potential to be the most impactful legislative change that can happen in the next 20 years, because of the points Paul was making about actually how, essentially, since the 80s and Friedman and all that kind of shareholder primacy and the idea that basically it's about maximising returns, that's actually causing most of the problems we're seeing today, or some of the big ones, on climate, on sector stagnation, because if you're forcing down essentially wages, there's less demand in the economy, there's less incentive for business to invest, you get stuck in a vicious circle, and then the point around patient capital. So that's the point about control. It's the point about control. So why are we not looking around trying to balance the input of other stakeholders into it? Because I think, Catherine, you were saying it's important to retain shareholder primacy. Isn't that point that shareholders are the only ones that are able to remove directors kind of the whole problem?
Right. So, Seema, can you respond to what's the distinct Labour offer? And then I think then maybe get Catherine and Paul to respond on the latter two questions around. Oh, maybe like the accountability one as well. You already mentioned it, but then I'll get so Catherine and Paul going on accountability and whether or not we effectively go further than Catherine's proposed Responsible Investment Act, I guess. Seema first.
Great, thank you. Look, I do think that we've taken a very important step, and it is not just a conference, because in a sense we've had dialogue through the year, and it is very much about seeing a shift in attitude, a shift in how we are seeing we've got to be engaged with business, because it has got to be very much about partnership. It's got to be a partnership in the public interest. It's got to be a partnership in the climate interest, and for kind of an integrated view about how we're going to challenge, how we're going to address the challenges of climate and of creating a more equal economy. I think Sadiq said today very powerfully, you can't be pro-green without being pro-business, and you can't be pro-worker without being pro-business. But you've got to have a way in which you're having a better relationship. And what we've been saying, what Keir said certainly in the speech some months ago, is we want businesses to have high expectations of labour, but in return we will have high expectations of business. And that's very much the kind of sentiment in which you've seen some of the announcements through conference today, including on the kind of steel transformation fund, and also Rachel's announcements today. But I think as well, we having discussions, and including, for example, we met with Anglian Water, who were the first UK utility company to change their constitution and to enshrine those positive values for the environment and within their articles, alongside policy profit making. There are different ways of doing things that aren't either or. And in fact, I might do a plug for something I did once a long time ago. But it was, I was working with the Judge Institute of Cambridge, and a group of us, we wrote the book Performance Prism, and it was about trying to challenge this whole perspective about how businesses measure, what they measure, why they measure it, and how you can have a different measures framework that actually be better for your business in the longer term. But it had those 5 dimensions and said you need to balance these of stakeholders. So one was your customers, one was employees, one was government and regulators, one was investors, and one was your suppliers. So you actually have a much more integrated view about how you're measuring your performance in relation to all of those and the wants and needs that they will have, and trying to shift away from just measuring on shareholder value alone. So I think there's been kind of pockets of thinking over the course of time. I do think there is a mood now to kind of bring some of that together and to increase the kind of accountability and sort of harder view of how we can sort of kind of enshrine sort of more accountability. And so I hope that that's a kind of some answer to the questions at least. But certainly I do feel that the next 3 to 6 months is going to be quite an important space in this as we sort of digest what COP26 brings and how I think we as a nation need to respond.
Thank you. Catherine, would like the next one to come on those points about accountability and whether or not stakeholders as a whole should have more rights of nomination and removal of directors.
Yeah, so well, let me first address the point on corporate due diligence and investor due diligence, which I'm extremely supportive of. So I think it should be an obligation on companies over a certain size, of big companies, to have a really good look at what's going on in their supply chain, because that, of course, is one of the places where it can become really tempting to take the lowest price supplier of X, Y, or Z, and that price is very low for a very good reason sometimes, which is that somebody or something is being exploited. So corporate due diligence, there's some very kind of interesting proposals on, as you said, in the Environment Bill, but also at the EU level. But I think it needs, again, to be matched by investor due diligence. And I should have said that the Responsible Investment Act, ShareAction published a model responsible investment bill last November. And one of the clauses is precisely about investor due diligence for human rights abuses and also for serious environmental crimes. That it would be an obligation on investors over a certain size who are looking after other people's money to have a good look at what's going on in the supply chain of companies that they own. But the other thing that's in that draft bill is something about kind of bringing more diverse voices into the capital markets. So we're proposing that pension funds should have an obligation to understand the priorities and interests of their members, because at the moment they just have this overriding single assumption and obligation to maximize financial returns, rather than asking you, presumably many of you are members of pension schemes, what are your priorities? What do you want maximized when someone else is investing in your name? So I think there are real opportunities to fix some of these things. And shareholder primacy, I'm not necessarily defending it. What I am saying is that the Better Business Act would keep it in place, and it needs to be matched by kind of corollary shifts in responsibility if we're going to get the system all working the way we need it.
Paul.
I can sort of bring it all together, hopefully. And this is all from the perspective of my worldview of people at the centre of everything and you work out the right decisions. The first one to sort of add to what Seema was saying was, we measure the economy on GDP, on EBITDA, on profits and things. But when the Industrial Revolution first started, 150 years ago, companies EBITDA wasn't a thing. They measured themselves on people-centric measures of success. How fewer children are dying in infancy? How much more education? How fewer people are in prison, or drunkenness there is less, or something like that, which is all encapsulated in the sort of Roundtree and all those Quaker sort of businesses. Now, I'm not suggesting we go back to Victorian values of how the economy was set, but I am saying these social indicators that were part of the success of a business grounds that business in the community that it serves and draws its workforce from and stuff like that. So we can return to that, and we can return to it in a modern way through what Catherine deals with all the time, is ESG type funds. And we've worked out with the financial numbers how world agreement about what EBITDA is and what profits are and how to measure those things. And we're getting there with the E on ESG. We're a long way away from the S, and that's kind of part of the problem, which comes back to the humanness and human rights piece. And if we center it with people, surely we've th the wherewithal to measure companies so that investors can take a holistic view of whether the company is what their pensioners would want their money spent with a measure on S, the social, the people type stuff that is meaningful and consistent across the world. Now, to Joe's question, I chair and I founded a human rights organisation in the UK, so I'm especially sensitive to the fact that accountability for wrong decisions that impinge on human welfare are not can be possible within businesses. I would look at what James wrote about, I think 18 months ago, something to do with social contract. We as a society now, when we go to an election and we ask politicians put their proposals of how society prioritises in society are, we should be thinking, I think, a little bit about the social contract we have with business as citizens, and the fact that we afford business directors limited liability for their decisions, which may impact human lives, kind of technically on the right side of the law, but are kind of not good for society. And in this last year or two, we've had the government coming in as the banker of last resort and the employer of last resort, things like that. Now, we should perhaps stand back and say, citizens, is that the right balance? A company that produces tobacco and encourages people to smoke gets limited liability, gets, they can do things to the environment, they can, etc. And we as citizens will bail them out if limited liability clause kicks in or something goes wrong for that company. And so we perhaps we should have a public debate in the realm of politics rather than the realm of economics. And the final sort of thing I would say is more specifically is accountability can come, a lot of this discussion we've had can come, I think, through another act, which is the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act, which is a Backbenchers Act at the moment, Caroline Lucas from Brighton and Lord Bird, which really says that when any piece of legislation is passed, due diligence ought to be done, and it has to be done, around the impact on that legislation on future generations, born and unborn. And we may get to a longer term view of what we want from society from that, and we may get the due diligence of questions raised that we otherwise would have missed in passing legislation.
Thank you very much, Paul. I'll try to do one last round of questions. I've got one there, and a hand there, and a hand there, and then we will wrap up. I'm sorry, yeah, right, so three. No, these three. Thank you very much. Gentleman there, back there, and then here. Then that'll be us.
Team chairman and Labour member, and I run my own business as well. This is a great conversation. I love the piece about metrics, and I think we really need to take this on. But I want to build on this question of the S and the ESG, and specifically thinking about the pandemic as a moment for us to reflect on change, both change on gender equality, particularly women's access to the workplace, and then change on kind of work-life balance. And I think, I have great flexibility because I run my own company. I can pick my kids up from school. I can, do lots of other things. I'm very fortunate in that respect. And I think the pandemic, for many people, and I think especially for women, but not just, became a moment of kind of reflecting on priorities and work-life balance. And I guess, how do we, you've inspired me, Paul, but I think it's a question for everyone is, how do we try to come out of the pandemic as a reset moment? And it's not just about
how to use the momentum. But
it's not just about flexible working. It's about societal norms. It's around women's access to the workplace, but it's about how we are flexible working in a broader way that really empowers people to live life and to work, not to live to work, but to work to live.
Lovely to hear the panel in furious agreement on what needs to be the direction of travel of corporate governance. You're agreeing with the US Business Roundtable, 240 CEOs whose statement of corporate purpose is basically stakeholder capitalism, which is a silent scream to politicians to get the activist hedge funds off their backs. Because what's happening now is that while we're focusing on shareholder privacy, business is being sold under the pressure of activist shareholders into private equity. Then that takes a whole chunk of the economy away from politicians.
I agree, and I agree with you entirely. The shift to private ownership poses a really interesting question for this agenda. So, thoughts on how, because obviously we're talking about pressure on public companies here, and so the question we put on the list is how these pressures can be applied to privately held companies. It's a really good question. And the last question can come from.
I work in the charitable sector, so this is all kind of new to me. But in terms of a better business act, how do you make sure it actually has teeth and that it isn't dependent upon the subjective or slightly dodgy view potentially of about what stakeholders, who they are, and what it is, and how do you make sure that it can be that enforced in some way and it's not just yet more virtue signaling?
Right, that's the section 172 question to you, Dick. So, right, I will we'll go for who wants to go first on those questions. So the pandemic, private ownership, and stakeholders, and then we'll wrap up, possibly with the work from our friends at the Better Business Act. Who's going to volunteer for let's jump on that train of questions?
Yeah,
Oh,
Fine.
In that case,
I'll just say.
Seema will speak last before running away with it.
I'll just say make one very brief point. I'll have to shoot, but I just want to come back to where I think there's a spirit of how communities came together in the pandemic. And I think there's a window in which we need to really build on that, because already people are kind of starting to go to work and kind of be separate from where they were. But it was, I think, a really important time of people reassessing their role and their contribution in local communities. And it is why I think that there ought to be a kind of a cooperative revival and a cooperative agenda, and an investment in the development of cooperatives, because I think in addressing some of the social challenges that we've seen as we've been much closer up in our communities as well, and thinking about where there can be social enterprises that can be part of sustainable solutions for community and social development, that we should be looking at that. I mean, that's why I did a paper that it was directed towards the London Mayor, and some of those recommendations have been taken forward by Sadiq. But I think there's an opportunity to really be saying, actually, nationally, we should be stepping up on cooperative solutions and how we get to invest in them, and possibly look at reform of legislation to be better for sort of cooperatives. Fewer barriers.
Thank you. Now, with that, I wish gives him a hand of thanks for we've had it for 8 more minutes on this question, and then we can return to the questions after she's decided. I think we've got a camera. We've got the internet has an interest to the panel.
Okay, social media, the tyranny of social media.
Yes, we'll feed the internet, and then we'll resume conversation.
Yeah, sure.
What I might do for the answer to the question about stakeholders, I might direct questions to our friends from the Business Act and Kirkup in these sections. Let's shuffle everyone around first, and then we'll return. Thank you very much.
Can I have a crack at the first question?
Yes. So Paul's going to answer the first, second, and third question.
Oh, right. Okay.
I don't know. Maybe not. Paul's going to answer the first question. Then